The radio crackled with static and desperation. All units fall back. I repeat, fall back to grid November 7 Whiskey. Major Richardson's voice carried the weight of a man watching his strategy crumble in real time. The Taliban had them pinned in the Helmand Valley, a killbox carved between shale cliffs and dead earth. Apache gunships circled overhead like frustrated hornets, low on fuel, lower on options. The ground commander's breath came in ragged bursts over the encrypted channel. 16 Marines were dug into fighting positions that had become graves in waiting. Then someone saw it, a gray silhouette piercing the cloud deck at 8,000 feet, trailing black smoke like a banner of defiance. The A-10 Thunderbolt II came down at an angle that made seasoned pilots wince. Its right engine was gutted, belching fire. The left engine screamed at maximum military power, compensating, refusing to quit. The aircraft's nose art was barely visible through the scorch marks, a raven clutching a broken chain, and beneath it, a single word in faded white letters: Revenant. The pilot inside wasn't supposed to be there. Captain Myra Volkova had been grounded 3 days prior after a near collision during a close air support run gone wrong. The incident report cited reckless disregard for safety protocols. Her squadron commander had been blunt. "You're a liability, Volkova. One more stunt and you're flying a desk." But when the distress call came through, when Richardson's voice broke through the afternoon haze with coordinates and casualty counts, Myra had walked past the flight surgeon, past the ops officer, and straight into the cockpit of the only A-10 still on the ramp with a combat load. Nobody stopped her. Nobody thought she'd actually take off. They were wrong. Now she dove through hostile airspace with half an engine and a full combat load of 30mm death. The Warthog shuddered, protesting every maneuver, but Myra's hands were steady on the stick. Below, insurgent positions lit up with muzzle flashes. The Marines were 20 seconds from being overrun. Richardson's voice came again, strained, almost pleading. "Any station, this is Phantom 6 Actual. We are danger close. I say again, danger close, fire mission." The transmission cut off. Replaced by something else. A woman's voice, calm as Sunday morning, cold as a blade. "Phantom 6, Revenant 1-1, I'm your fire mission. Mark your position with smoke. Stay low." There was a pause. Then Richardson, confused, almost angry. "Revenant, you're not on the air tasking order. Who authorized? Does it matter?" Myra's A-10 rolled inverted, engine fire spiraling with her, and began its attack run. The Helmand Valley had seen war for generations. It had swallowed empires, chewed through armies, and left bones to bleach under an indifferent sun. The cliffs on either side funneled wind and violence in equal measure, creating thermals that could flip an aircraft or save it, depending on the pilot's skill and the sky's mood. Myra Volkova knew these winds. She'd flown this valley 17 times in the past 4 months, each mission carving the terrain deeper into her muscle memory. She knew where the updrafts waited, where the enemy loved to dig in, where the stone turned to shale and swallowed tracer rounds. She knew it the way a pianist knows Chopin, intimately, instinctively, beyond thought. The A-10 screamed downward at an angle that violated every flight manual ever written. Her damaged engine shrieked in protest, throwing chunks of turbine blade into the slipstream. Warning lights painted the cockpit red and amber. Master caution, fire, hydraulic pressure dropping, oil temp spiking. The stick fought her, sluggish with asymmetric thrust, but Myra's grip never wavered. She'd grown up in the Rust Belt, daughter of a Ukrainian machinist who'd fled Chernobyl's shadow and a mother who'd worked 3 jobs to keep the lights on. Her hands had learned to compensate for broken things long before she ever touched a control stick. Below the Marine position was a desperate cluster of sandbags and shallow scrapes in the hardpan. 16 men pressed into the earth, returning fire when they could, mostly just trying not to die. The Taliban had them in a classic L-shaped ambush, machine gun nests in the rocks, RPG teams moving to flank. It was textbook, brutal, effective. Richardson had already called for medevac twice. Both birds had been driven off by ground fire. Now he was down to counting rounds and writing letters in his head. Revenant 1-1, Phantom 6. Richardson transmitted, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Targets are troops in the open, 70 meters north of my smoke. How copy?" "Good copy, Phantom. Heads down." Myra's thumb moved to the trigger. The GAU-8 Avenger rotated, 7 barrels aligning, 3,000 rounds of 30mm hatred waiting. The gun made up most of the A-10's fuselage, a flying cannon with just enough airplane wrapped around it to get the weapon to the fight. Myra pulled the trigger. The world ended in a sound like God tearing canvas. The gun fired at 65 rounds per second, each projectile the size of a milk bottle, each one carrying enough kinetic energy to punch through tank armor. The recoil was so violent it slowed the aircraft mid-flight, a full 10% loss of airspeed every time she squeezed the trigger. The effect on the ground was apocalyptic. The Taliban position simply ceased to exist, replaced by a churning cloud of dust, shattered stone, and red mist. Myra walked the fire across the hillside, 2-second bursts, textbook precision. The ground erupted in a linear path of devastation that moved with mechanical precision through the enemy positions. Myra's damaged A-10 shuddered with each burst, the asymmetric thrust trying to yaw her off target, but she compensated with rudder and aileron, flying the gun as much as the airplane. The Taliban fighters who'd been advancing on the Marine position scattered, some diving for cover that no longer existed, others simply falling as 30mm rounds found them. The technical mounted with a heavy machine gun, the one that had been chewing through the Marines' sandbag positions, exploded in a ball of orange flame as Myra stitched rounds through its engine block and fuel tank. "Revenant, Phantom 6, good hits, good hits." Richardson's voice carried disbelief and desperate hope in equal measure. "I need you on that ridgeline 85 meters west, multiple dismounts with RPGs." "Tally," Myra said, her eyes already tracking the movement. She pulled the A-10 into a hard right bank, the damaged engine coughing black smoke, fire still trailing from the cowling like a war banner. The aircraft bucked and protested, but it turned. She lined up on the ridgeline where figures crouched with tube-shaped weapons on their shoulders, and fired again. The Avenger roared. The ridgeline disintegrated. Somewhere in the back of her mind, Myra was aware of the cockpit warnings multiplying, aware that her right engine was now completely dead, the fire spreading toward the fuel lines. She was aware that she was flying on borrowed time, that every second she stayed in this fight was a second closer to punching out over hostile territory, if she could punch out at all. But the Marines were still pinned. Richardson was still calling targets. And Myra Volkova had not flown through a medical hold, and a commander's direct order to leave a job half-finished. She pulled into another attack run, ignoring the fire, ignoring the warnings, ignoring everything except the geometry of violence and salvation. The Taliban had learned to fear the A-10's profile, that ugly, ungainly shape that meant death from above. Now they learned to fear it wreathed in flames, piloted by someone who'd already decided which side of the line between mission and suicide she was standing on. Richardson watched from the ground, his face pressed into the dirt as the burning warthog made another pass. He'd been in combat for 8 years, 3 deployments, more firefights than he could count. He'd seen Apache light up mountainsides, seen fast movers drop 1,000-pound bombs with surgical precision, but he'd never seen anything like this. Never seen a pilot stay in the fight while their aircraft was actively trying to kill them. "Revenant," he transmitted, his voice raw. "You're on fire. You need to egress, I repeat, egress and get that bird on the ground." "Negative, Phantom," Myra's voice came back, still calm, still focused. "You've got more dismounts moving in from the north. I'm not done." She wasn't. The A-10 came around again, trailing more smoke now, the fire creeping along the wing route. The aircraft's flight characteristics were degrading by the second. The stick required constant pressure to keep the nose level, and even then, the warthog wanted to roll right, toward the dead engine, toward the earth. Myra's arms burned with the effort of keeping it flying. Her flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the rushing cold air through the damaged canopy seal. But her eyes were clear, tracking the new group of fighters emerging from a wadi to the north. 12. maybe 15 dismounts, moving with the confident tactical spacing of experienced insurgents. She didn't have enough gun left for another sustained burst, maybe 15 seconds of trigger time, tops, and her remaining engine was starting to run rough, sympathetic damage from the fire spreading through the engine bay. Basic physics and aerodynamics were about to have their say, but 15 seconds was enough, had to be enough. Myra nosed over into her final attack run, and somewhere far away, in a part of her mind not consumed by angle of attack and lead calculations, she thought about her father, how he'd survived Chernobyl by refusing to panic when everyone else ran, how he'd taught her that broken things could still work if you understood them well enough. The A-10 was a broken thing now, but Myra understood it, and it still had work to do. The Taliban fighters in the Wadi heard it coming, that distinctive sound of the A-10's turbofans, deeper and more menacing than any other aircraft in the American arsenal. They looked up and saw the Warthog descending through its own smoke trail, trailing fire like some mythical bird of prey that refused to die. Some of them raised their weapons. Most of them just ran. Myra fired. The GAU-8 howled one last time, spending the last of its ammunition in a final devastating burst that turned the Wadi into a kill zone. Then the gun went silent, barrels still spinning but empty, and Myra pulled up hard on the stick, coaxing the crippled A-10 into a climb that felt more like a prayer than aerodynamics. "Phantom 6 Revenant," she transmitted, her voice finally showing strain. "Winchester on gun, I'm egressing north, need vectors to nearest emergency landing. Revenant, you just saved 16 lives," Richardson cut in, and his voice was thick with emotion he wasn't trained to hide. "You're clear on all flanks, we're secure, I say again, we are secure." The words hung in the air, mixing with the smoke and the distant sound of secondary explosions. Secure. It was a word that meant everything in combat. It meant survival, mission success, going home. Myra let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Her left hand was shaking on the throttle. "Copy that, Phantom," she said quietly. "Glad I could help. Now someone tell me where I'm putting this thing down because I've got about 90 seconds of flight time left." The radio exploded with voices, air traffic control, rescue coordination, her own squadron commander who'd apparently been listening to the whole thing. Everyone had an opinion, a suggestion, a procedure. But it was an unfamiliar voice that cut through the chatter, deep and authoritative, with the accent of the American South. "Revenant 1-1, this is Sledgehammer 6 Actual. I'm orbiting 20 miles north in a KC-135, and I've got eyes on a strip at Forward Operating Base Chapman. Bearing 355, 16 miles, can you make it?" Myra checked her instruments. 16 miles. Her right engine was completely gone, the fire now spreading to the wing. Her left engine was running on fumes and damage and sheer stubbornness. Hydraulics were at 30%. She had no weapons, minimal control authority, and the A-10 was flying like a brick with a bad attitude. 16 miles might as well have been 1,000. But Myra Volkova had not come this far to die in sight of a runway. "Sledgehammer 6 Revenant," she said, and there was something in her voice now, something harder than steel, older than the war. "I'll make it. Just make sure they've got the crash trucks ready." She banked the dying Warthog north and pointed its nose towards survival or whatever came next. The flight to Fob Chapman took 7 minutes that felt like hours. Myra nursed the A-10 through the air like a wounded animal, constantly adjusting, compensating, coaxing. The fire in the right engine bay had spread to the wing, burning through hydraulic lines and control surfaces. The ailerons were barely responding. The rudder was sluggish. Everything that made the Warthog fly was systematically failing, and yet somehow it kept flying, kept clawing forward through the thin mountain air on one engine and willpower. Below, the Helmand Valley gave way to brown ridgelines and patches of green where irrigation brought life to the desert. Myra watched it pass beneath her with the strange clarity that comes when death is close enough to feel its breath. She thought about the Marines she'd just saved, wondered if they had families, wondered if they'd remember her name. Probably not. Close air support pilots were ghosts to the ground troops, voices on the radio, then gone. That had always been fine with her. She hadn't joined the Air Force for recognition. She joined because flying was the only thing that ever made sense. Revenant Sledgehammer 6, the tanker pilot transmitted. I've got you on radar 12 miles out. Chapman is clearing the runway. Emergency equipment is standing by. How's your aircraft? Myra glanced at the caution panel, which looked like a Christmas tree of red and amber lights. I've had better days, she said dryly, but we're still flying. Copy that. Listen, Revenant, when you get on the ground, drinks are on me. I don't drink, Myra said. Then I'll buy you the best cup of coffee in Kandahar province. Despite everything, Myra smiled. Deal. Fob Chapman appeared on the horizon, a collection of prefab buildings, tents, and blast walls arranged around a single dirt runway. It wasn't much to look at, but right now it was the most beautiful thing Myra had ever seen. She started her descent, keeping the approach shallow, conserving what little control authority she had left. The wind was out of the west at 15 knots, gusting to 20. Normally that would be nothing. Today it was everything. The crosswind caught the A-10's damaged wing and tried to flip her. Myra fought it with rudder and aileron, her feet pressing hard on the pedals, her arms straining against the stick. The aircraft yawed, fishtailed, then steadied. Sort of. Revenant Chapman Tower, winds 300 at 15 gusting 20, runway 28, you're cleared to land. Emergency equipment is standing by. Chapman, Revenant Roger, Myra said, lining up on final approach. The runway stretched ahead of her, a strip of dirt and aggregate that looked impossibly narrow, impossibly short. Her airspeed was too high. She couldn't slow down enough without risking a stall from the asymmetric thrust. Her altitude was too low. She had no engine power to spare for a go-around. This was a one-shot deal. She'd either make it or she wouldn't. There was a certain peace in that certainty. Crossed the runway threshold at 180 knots, 40 knots too fast, trailing smoke and fire. Myra pulled the throttle to idle, raised the nose slightly, and waited for the main gear to kiss the earth. For a moment she was floating, suspended between sky and ground, between life and whatever came after. Then the wheels touched down with a jolt that rattled her teeth. The Warthog bounced, slammed down again, and Myra stood on the brakes, feeling them grab and bite through the damaged hydraulics. The aircraft decelerated, shuddering, protesting, but slowing. The end of the runway rushed toward her. She wasn't going to stop in time. Myra made a decision. She cranked the nose wheel hard right, deliberately ground-looping the A-10 off the runway and onto the dirt. The aircraft spun 90 degrees, the gear screaming in protest, and finally lurched to a stop in a cloud of dust and smoke. For a moment there was silence. Then the fire trucks arrived, sirens wailing, foam cannons already spraying. Myra sat in the cockpit, hands still on the controls, heart hammering in her chest. She'd made it. Against all odds, against physics and probability and common sense, she'd made it. She popped the canopy and breathed in the acrid smell of burning metal and jet fuel and foam. It smelled like victory. The medical team reached her first, clambering up the side of the smoking A-10, shouting questions she couldn't quite process. Was she injured? Could she move? Did she need assistance? Myra waved them off, unbuckling her harness with hands that were finally starting to shake now that the adrenaline was fatting. She climbed out of the cockpit under her own power, stepping onto the wing, then jumping down to the dirt. Her legs nearly buckled, but she caught herself, stood straight. Around her, the emergency crews were dousing the A-10 with foam, killing the fire that had carried her all the way from Helmand. The aircraft looked like it had been through hell, because it had. Scorch marks blackened the fuselage. The right engine was a gutted wreck, and the wing had burned through in 3 places. It would never fly again, but it had flown long enough. A Humvee skidded to a stop nearby, and a man in a flight suit climbed out. He was in his 50s, silver hair cut high and tight, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent a career in the sun and the sky. His name tag read Winters, and his rank insignia marked him as a colonel, Myra's squadron commander. He walked toward her with measured steps, his expression unreadable. Myra straightened despite her exhaustion, preparing for the reprimand she knew was coming. She'd violated a grounding order, stolen an aircraft, and flown an unauthorized combat mission. By any reasonable standard, her career was over. But when Colonel Winters reached her, he didn't yell. He didn't even speak. He just looked at her for a long moment, then at the smoking remains of the A-10, then back at her. Finally, he said, "That was the most reckless, insubordinate, and stupidly heroic thing I've seen in 30 years of service." Myra met his eyes. "Yes, sir. 16 Marines are alive because of you. Yes, sir. Your aircraft is a total loss. Yes, sir." Winters shook his head slowly, a gesture that might have been frustration or might have been something else entirely. "You know I have to write this up. There will be an investigation. There will be paperwork, a lot of paperwork." "I understand, sir." "Good." He paused, then extended his hand. "But before all that official business starts, I want to say, as one pilot to another, that was some of the finest flying I've ever seen. You should be proud." Myra took his hand, felt the firm grip, saw something in his eyes that looked like respect, maybe even admiration. "Thank you, sir. Now go get yourself checked out by the docs. That's an order you're actually going to follow, right?" Myra managed a tired smile. "Yes, sir." She turned toward the medical tent, her body finally registering all the aches and pains it had been ignoring during the flight. But before she'd taken 3 steps, another voice called out from across the flight line. "Revenant," she turned. A group of men in desert camouflage was approaching, led by a Marine major with dust-caked face and the hard eyes of someone who just walked out of a kill zone. Richardson. He covered the distance quickly, followed by 3 of his Marines, all of them looking like they'd been through a meat grinder. Richardson stopped in front of her, seemed to struggle for words, then settled on the simplest ones. "Thank you." The emotion in his voice was raw and unguarded. "Thank you for coming back. Thank you for not leaving us." Myra nodded, throat suddenly tight. "Just doing my job, Major." "Bullshit," one of the Marines behind Richardson said, young kid with corporal chevrons and a nasty cut above his eye. "That wasn't your job, that was—" He stopped, searching for the word. "That was something else." Richardson stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I've been in a lot of tight spots, Captain. I've had a lot of air support pull our asses out of the fire, but I've never seen anyone fly into hell like you did today. Never seen anyone stay in the fight when their plane was literally falling apart around them." He paused, then reached into his pocket and pulled something out, a patch, the unit insignia of his Marine company. He offered it to her. "This belongs to you now. You bled for my Marines today. That makes you one of us." Myra took the patch, felt the rough fabric against her palm. It was a small thing, just cloth and thread, but the weight of it felt immense. She looked at Richardson, at the 3 Marines behind him, at the smoke still rising from her broken aircraft. This was why she joined. Not for the medals or the recognition, not even for the flying itself, but for this, for standing between people and the darkness, for making sure someone went home to their family. "I'm honored," she said quietly, and meant it. Richardson nodded, started to turn away, then stopped. "What's the story behind your call sign?" he asked. "Revenant, that's a ghost, right? Something that comes back from the dead." Myra's expression flickered just for a moment with something old and painful. "Something like that," she said. Richardson waited, sensing there was more, but Myra didn't elaborate. Some stories weren't meant for strangers, even strangers whose lives you just saved. The story behind the call sign was 7 years old, earned on a desert afternoon in Kandahar province when Myra Volkova was still a lieutenant with more confidence than experience. She'd been flying a routine patrol with her wingman, a hotshot captain named Danny Ortega who'd taken her under his wing when she first arrived in country. They were part of a 4-ship, flying lazy circles over Route Hammer, watching for IED emplacements and Taliban movement. It was supposed to be boring. It was supposed to be safe. Then Danny's A-10 took a SAM in the left engine, a Chinese-made missile that screamed up from a ridgeline and punched through his fuselage like it was made of paper. Myra saw it happen from 1,000 yards away, the flash, the smoke, the immediate loss of control. Danny's aircraft rolled, inverted, and began the sickening spiral toward the earth that every pilot fears. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," Danny's voice crackled over the radio, strained but controlled. "Viper 2-1 is hit. I've lost an engine and I'm not sure I can." the transmission cut off. His A-10 was spinning now inverted 3,000 feet and falling fast. Myra watched, frozen for a single heartbeat as her brain processed what her eyes were seeing. Then her hands moved. She rolled her A-10 hard, diving after Danny's crippled aircraft, pushing the throttles to full military power. The ground rushed up at both of them, brown earth and scattered rocks resolving into terrifying detail. "Danny, Myra, you're inverted, roll right now," she shouted into the radio. No response. Danny's A-10 continued its death spiral. 2,000 feet, 1,500, the ground was seconds away. Myra did something that was either brilliant or insane, depending on who told the story afterward. She positioned her A-10 directly above Danny's, close enough that her wingtip was feet from his canopy, and waggled her wings violently, trying to get his attention through the disorientation and panic. "Danny, look at me, look at me." It worked. Maybe. Danny's aircraft jerked, seemed to stabilize for a moment, then continued falling. 1,000 feet. Myra stayed with him, inverted, matching his descent, her voice steady on the radio despite the fear clawing at her chest. "Roll with me on my mark. 3, 2, 1 mark." She rolled right, and somehow, impossibly, Danny rolled with her. His A-10 came right side up 500 feet above the desert floor, still descending but flying now instead of falling. "Power, Danny, give it power," Myra urged. His good engine spooled up, and the death spiral became a shallow glide, then a controlled descent. 200 feet, 100. Danny aimed for a dry lakebed and brought his crippled warthog down in a cloud of dust and gravel, the landing gear collapsing on impact, but the fuselage mostly intact. Myra circled overhead, watching as Danny popped his canopy and climbed out, shaken but alive. The rescue helicopter arrived 20 minutes later. Danny was medevaced out with a concussion and 3 broken ribs, but he was alive. That night back at base, he'd found her in the mess tent and said, "You came back for me. When I was inverted, when I couldn't think straight, you came back." He'd smiled, tired and grateful. "You're like a revenant, a ghost that refuses to let people die." The name stuck. At first, Myra had hated it. It sounded pretentious, dramatic. But over time, it became something else. A reminder of what she was capable of when everything went wrong. A reminder that coming back for people mattered. Danny had made it home to his wife and 2 kids. That was what mattered. The investigation into Myra's unauthorized flight took 3 weeks. She spent most of that time grounded again, writing statements, sitting through interviews, watching as senior officers debated her fate behind closed doors. The charges were serious: violation of a direct order, unauthorized use of military equipment, reckless endangerment. The fact that she'd saved 16 lives was noted, certainly, but it didn't erase the fact that she'd broken rules that existed for good reasons. Some officers wanted her court-martialed, others wanted her decorated. The debate raged while Myra sat in limbo, wondering if she'd ever fly again. Colonel Winters visited her once during those 3 weeks, found her in the squadron ready room staring at weather reports she had no reason to read. "How are you holding up?" he asked. Myra shrugged. "I've been better, sir." Winters sat down across from her, leaned back in his chair. "For what it's worth, I've been fighting for you, so have a lot of other people. Richardson submitted a letter, so did every one of his Marines. Hell, even the tanker pilot you talked to is vouching for you, and he never even met you." "Will it matter?" Myra asked quietly. "Honestly, I don't know. The brass is divided. Some of them see a hero, some of them see a liability." He paused. "What do you see when you look in the mirror?" Myra thought about that. What did she see? A woman who'd watched too many people die, a pilot who couldn't follow orders when lives were on the line, a daughter of immigrants who'd fought for every opportunity and refused to waste them. Maybe all of those things, maybe none. "I see someone who'd do it again," she said finally. Winters nodded slowly. "Yeah, I thought you might say that." The decision came down on a Thursday afternoon. Myra was summoned to the base commander's office, a small prefab building that smelled like bad coffee and bureaucracy. She walked in expecting the worst, prepared to accept whatever judgment came with a straight back and clear eyes. The commander, a 2-star general named Patterson, looked up from a stack of papers and gestured to a chair. "Sit down, Captain." Myra sat. Patterson studied her for a moment, his expression giving nothing away. I've read every statement, every report, every recommendation related to your actions on October 14th. I've talked to Major Richardson. I've talked to Colonel Winters. I've talked to the Air Force Judge Advocate General's office." He paused. "Do you know what the hardest part of my job is, Captain?" "No, sir," Myra said. "It's balancing the need for discipline with the reality of combat. Rules exist for reasons. Chain of command exists for reasons. If everyone just did whatever they thought was right, we'd have chaos." He leaned forward. "But war isn't a classroom exercise. Sometimes the right decision and the authorized decision aren't the same thing. Sometimes exceptional circumstances require exceptional actions." He picked up a paper from his desk. "This is a letter of reprimand. It will go in your permanent file. It states that you violated a direct order and that such behavior cannot and will not be tolerated." Myra's heart sank. "I understand, sir." "I'm not finished," Patterson said. He picked up a second paper. "This is a recommendation for the Distinguished Flying Cross. It states that you displayed extraordinary heroism in combat, saving the lives of 16 Marines under extreme circumstances, and that you demonstrated the highest qualities of military service." Myra blinked, not quite processing. "Sir, I don't." "You're getting both, Captain," Patterson said firmly. "The reprimand because you broke the rules and you need to understand that has consequences. The medal because you saved lives and we need to recognize that. You're a complicated case, Volkova. You're one of the best pilots in this theater, but you're also one of the most difficult to command. So here's what's going to happen. You're going back to flight status. You're going to continue flying combat missions, and you're going to follow orders, all of them, even the ones you don't like. Are we clear?" "Crystal clear, sir," Myra said, relief flooding through her. "Good, dismissed." Myra stood, saluted, and turned to leave. She was almost to the door when Patterson spoke again. "Captain?" "Yes, sir." "That thing you did, staying in the fight while your aircraft was on fire, don't do that again. Next time you eject." "Understood." Myra smiled slightly. "I'll do my best, sir." She flew 73 more combat missions over the next 8 months. Each one was by the book. Well, mostly by the book. She provided close air support for ground troops, flew reconnaissance over hostile territory, and conducted armed overwatch for convoy operations. She became known as the pilot you wanted on station when things went bad, the one who would stay until the job was done or the fuel ran out, whichever came first. Her call sign spread beyond her squadron, became a name that ground commanders asked for specifically. "Get me Revenant," they'd say when the fighting got tight. "Get me that crazy A-10 pilot who doesn't quit." But Myra never thought of herself as crazy. She thought of herself as careful, careful about what mattered. Aircraft could be replaced. Lives couldn't. That calculus had guided her through every mission since she'd earned her wings, and it would guide her through every mission to come. The Distinguished Flying Cross ceremony was held on a clear morning in early spring, the kind of day when the Afghan sky turned a shade of blue so perfect it hurt to look at. Myra stood in formation with 11 other recipients, all of them receiving medals for various acts of valor, all of them uncomfortable with the attention. She wore her dress blues, the fabric stiff and unfamiliar after months in flight suits and body armor. General Patterson was there, along with Colonel Winters and what seemed like half the base. When her name was called, Myra marched forward, stood at attention as Patterson pinned the medal to her uniform and read the citation aloud. The words washed over her: extraordinary heroism, complete disregard for personal safety, saved the lives of 16 United States Marines. They were true words, but they felt like they described someone else, some fictional hero rather than a woman who'd just been trying to do her job. After the ceremony, there was a reception, cake and coffee and handshakes from people she barely knew. Major Richardson was there, no longer dust-covered and bleeding, looking almost unrecognizable in his dress uniform. He found her standing by herself near the edge of the gathering, staring out at the flight line where A-10s were taxiing for afternoon missions. "Congratulations," he said. "Thank you," Myra replied. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the warthogs take off in pairs, their turbofans growling, their ungainly shapes somehow graceful against the blue sky. "Do you ever regret it?" Richardson asked. "Regret what?" "What you did that day, breaking the rules, risking everything." Myra thought about it. Did she regret it? The reprimand in her file would follow her for the rest of her career, probably cost her promotions, definitely cost her opportunities. But 16 men had gone home to their families. 16 sets of parents, spouses, children hadn't received flag-draped coffins and condolence letters. 16 lives continued. "No," she said simply, "I don't." Richardson nodded as if he'd expected that answer. "Good, because I wanted to tell you something. My wife is pregnant. We just found out last week. It's our first." He looked at her and his eyes were bright with emotion. "I get to meet my kid because of you. I get to be a father." His voice broke. "That's everything." Myra felt her own throat tighten. "Congratulations, Major, really." The deployment ended 6 weeks later. Myra rotated back to the States, back to a world of peacetime training missions and routine patrols that felt surreal after a year of combat. She was assigned to a squadron at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, where the sky was just as blue as Afghanistan, but nobody was shooting at her. It should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like waiting, for what, she wasn't sure. The other pilots treated her with a mixture of respect and wariness, like she was a loaded weapon that might go off unexpectedly. They'd all heard the story, of course. It had spread through the A-10 community like wildfire, growing more mythologized with each retelling until Myra barely recognized herself in it. In the stories, she was fearless, superhuman, unstoppable. In reality, she was just a pilot trying to figure out what came next. Colonel Winters called her into his office 3 months after she returned. He'd rotated back a few weeks before her, had taken over as the wing commander at Davis-Monthan. "How are you adjusting?" he asked. "Fine, sir," Myra said, which was mostly true and mostly a lie. "Bullshit," Winters said mildly. "I've seen that look before. You're bored, you miss it." Myra started to deny it, then stopped. What was the point of lying to a man who'd spent 30 years reading pilots? "Maybe," she admitted. "Is that wrong?" "No," Winters said. "It's human. Combat is terrible, but it's also clarifying. Everything matters. Every decision has weight. Then you come home and you're supposed to care about quarterly training reports and uniform inspections, and it all feels pointless," Myra offered. "I was going to say different, but yeah, pointless works too." He leaned back in his chair. "I'm not going to tell you it gets easier, because it doesn't, not really, but it changes. You find new things to care about, new ways to make a difference." "Like what?" Myra asked. "Like teaching," Winters said. "Passing on what you know to the next generation of pilots, making sure they don't have to learn everything the hard way." He pulled a folder from his desk and slid it across to her. "I'm putting you in charge of our new weapons school program. You'll be training young pilots in close air support tactics, emergency procedures, combat decision-making. It's not the same as flying combat missions, but it's important. Maybe more important in the long run." Myra opened the folder, scanned the contents. It was a comprehensive training curriculum, the kind of thing that would shape how A-10 pilots were prepared for combat for years to come. She could see her own experiences woven through it, lessons learned the hard way, mistakes that had almost killed her, successes that had saved lives. "You want me to teach people how to do what I did?" she asked. Winters smiled. "I want you to teach them how to think like you do. The flying part they can learn anywhere. The decision-making, the judgment, the refusal to quit, that's harder to teach. But you can do it." Myra closed the folder, felt the weight of it in her hands. A new mission, a different way to serve. "When do I start?" she asked. "Monday," Winters said. "And Volkova, don't fuck this up." She smiled. "No promises, sir." The weapons school started with 6 students, all of them lieutenants fresh from combat training, all of them cocky and confident in the way that comes from having just enough skill to be dangerous but not enough experience to know how dangerous they were. Myra recognized that cockiness. She'd worn it herself once, before the desert had sanded it away and left something harder and more durable underneath. The students sat in a classroom on that first Monday morning, eyeing her with curiosity and barely concealed skepticism. She was younger than most of their previous instructors, a captain rather than a major or lieutenant colonel. And she was a woman in an airframe that was still overwhelmingly flown by men. Myra stood at the front of the classroom and let the silence stretch for a moment. Then she said, "My name is Captain Volkova. You can call me Revenant because that's what everyone calls me. I'm going to be teaching you close air support tactics for the next 12 weeks. Some of you have already decided I'm not qualified to teach you. Some of you are wondering why they assigned a woman to this job. Some of you have heard stories about me and think they're exaggerated." She paused. "You're wrong on all three counts." One of the students, a lieutenant with the kind of square jaw that belonged in a recruiting poster, raised his hand. "Question, ma'am. Go ahead. What makes you qualified to teach us?" It wasn't asked with respect. It was a challenge, a test. Myra had expected it. "What's your name, Lieutenant?" "Garrett, ma'am." "Okay, Garrett. I'm qualified because I've flown 93 combat missions in 3 deployments. I've employed every weapon system on the A-10. I've supported ground operations in 5 different countries. I've been shot at by everything from small arms to SAMs, and I'm still here." She stepped closer. "But most importantly, I'm qualified because I've made mistakes, big ones, and I've learned from them. That's what I'm going to teach you, not just how to fly, but how to make decisions when everything is going wrong and people's lives depend on you getting it right." The classroom was silent now. Even Garrett was paying attention. Myra continued, her voice steady and certain. "Over the next 12 weeks, we're going to break you down and build you back up. We're going to put you in scenarios that seem impossible. We're going to make you think harder than you've ever thought, fly better than you've ever flown, and push you past where you think your limits are. Some of you won't make it through the program. That's not a threat, it's a promise. This isn't a participation trophy course. This is preparation for the worst day of your life, the day when you're the only thing between a ground team and disaster." She looked at each of them in turn. "Questions?" A woman in the back row, Lieutenant Kim, raised her hand. "Yes. Is it true you flew a mission while your aircraft was on fire?" Myra smiled thinly. "Yes." "And you stayed in the fight?" "Yes." "Why?" It was a simple question with a complicated answer. Myra could have given them the sanitized version, the one about duty and mission completion and never leaving a job unfinished. But these pilots were about to trust her with their training, maybe eventually with their lives. They deserved the truth. "Because 16 Marines were about to die," she said quietly. "And I had the training, the weapons, and the opportunity to save them. Everything else, my safety, my aircraft, my career, was secondary to that." "Would I do it again?" She paused. "In a heartbeat, but I'd also rather teach you how to complete the mission without having to make that choice. How to be so good, so well prepared that you can save lives without sacrificing your own. That's what we're here for." The room was absolutely still. Then Garrett, the skeptical lieutenant, nodded once. "Okay," he said, "I'm in." The others murmured agreement. Myra felt something shift in the room, a subtle change from resistance to readiness. "Good," she said. "Then let's get to work." The 12 weeks were brutal. Myra pushed her students through scenarios that would have broken lesser pilots: engine failures on approach, battle damage simulations, close air support missions with danger-close friendly positions, all of it conducted in flight simulators so realistic they induced vertigo and sweat. She taught them to think 3 steps ahead, to have a backup plan for their backup plan, to never accept "can't be done" as an answer. She taught them radio discipline, target identification, the geometry of attack runs and escape maneuvers. She taught them how to read a battlefield from 3,000 feet, how to distinguish friendly from enemy in terrain where everything looked the same, how to make life-or-death decisions in seconds. But more than tactics and procedures, she taught them judgment. "Anyone can pull a trigger," she told them during a late-night classroom session after a particularly grueling sim run. "Any idiot can drop a bomb or fire a gun. What separates a competent pilot from an exceptional one is knowing when not to shoot." She told them stories, not war stories meant to glorify combat, but teaching stories meant to illustrate principles. She told them about the time she'd almost fired on a civilian vehicle because the driver had made an unexpected turn. She told them about missions where she'd held fire despite having clearance because something felt wrong, and how that hesitation had saved lives. She told them about the mistakes she'd made, the close calls, the nights she'd lain awake replaying her decisions and wondering if she'd done the right thing. Combat is ambiguous, she said. The textbooks give you clean scenarios with clear right answers. The real world gives you chaos and incomplete information and seconds to decide. I can't prepare you for every situation you'll face, but I can teach you how to think, how to trust your training and your instincts, how to live with the decisions you make. Lieutenant Kim approached her after class one evening, hesitant and uncertain. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever doubt yourself? After a mission, I mean. Do you ever wonder if you made the right call?" Myra looked at the young pilot, saw herself from years ago, eager, talented, but not yet tested by the weight of consequence. "Every time," she said honestly. "Every single time, and if I ever stop doubting, stop questioning, that's when I need to stop flying." Because doubt keeps you sharp. It keeps you honest. It keeps you from thinking you're invincible. "But how do you live with it?" Kim asked. "The doubt, the second guessing." "You focus on the mission," Myra said. "You trust your training, you do your best with the information you have, and then you live with the outcome. And if you make a mistake, you learn from it and try not to make it again." She paused. "But mostly, you remember why you're doing this. It's not about glory or medals or call signs. It's about the people on the ground who are counting on you. That's what matters." By week 8, Myra's students had transformed. Garrett, the skeptical one, had become one of her best pilots, his natural talent honed by discipline and humility. Kim had developed an almost intuitive sense for battlefield geometry, reading terrain and target patterns like she'd been doing it for years. The others had found their strengths, some in precision, some in adaptability, all of them in perseverance. They worked together now, not as individuals but as a team, calling out threats and covering each other's blind spots the way combat pilots had to. Myra watched them during a four-ship formation training exercise and felt something unexpected: pride. These pilots were going to be good, maybe great, and when they deployed, when they found themselves in impossible situations over hostile territory, they'd have the tools and the judgment to come home. That was worth every long night, every grueling scenario, every moment of doubt. The graduation ceremony was small, just the 6 students, Colonel Winters, and a handful of squadron personnel. Myra stood before her students one last time, looking at pilots who'd arrived as promising rookies and were leaving as combat-ready warriors. "You've earned your place in this community," she told them. "You've proven you have the skill, the judgment, and the heart to fly the A-10 in combat. But remember, this is just the beginning. Everything you've learned here is foundation. The real education starts when you're downrange, when it's not a simulation and people's lives actually depend on you." She handed each of them their graduation certificates and weapons school patches. When she reached Garrett, he said quietly, "Thank you, ma'am, for not giving up on us, for pushing us." "Thank you for letting me," Myra replied. After the ceremony, as the students celebrated and traded war stories they didn't actually have yet, Colonel Winters pulled Myra aside. "That was good work," he said. "Really good. Those pilots are ready." "Thank you, sir. I'm putting in a recommendation for your promotion to major. It's overdue and you've more than earned it." Myra nodded, touched but also aware of what the promotion meant: more responsibility, more desk time, less flying. "I appreciate that, sir. You don't sound excited." "I'm a pilot, sir. I belong in a cockpit, not behind a desk." Winters smiled. "Who said anything about a desk? We need good instructors, Volkova, and we need good leaders who understand what it means to be downrange. You can do both." 3 years passed. Myra made major, took over as the operations officer for her squadron, and continued teaching. She flew when she could, trained when she had to, and watched as her students deployed and returned, bringing back their own stories and their own lessons learned. Some of them stayed in touch, sending emails from FOBs in Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan, thanking her for preparing them, asking for advice on situations she'd never imagined but somehow they'd found themselves in anyway. A few were wounded. None were killed. Myra counted that as a success. Then came the morning when Colonel Winters, now a general, called her into his office and told her about a new assignment. "We're standing up an A-10 demonstration team," he said. "Air shows, public relations, recruitment. The Air Force wants to show off what the Warthog can do, and they want the best pilot in the community to fly it. That's you." Myra frowned. "Sir, with respect, I'm not an air show pilot. I'm a combat pilot. I belong downrange, I know," Winters interrupted. "You've said that about 100 times, and you're right. But here's the thing, Volkova, you've done your time in combat. You've trained the next generation. Now it's time to do something else. To show the American people what their Air Force does, what the A-10 means, why it matters. To inspire the next generation of pilots before they even join." "I don't need to inspire anyone," Myra protested. "I just need to fly." "Wrong," Winters said firmly. "You've spent your career proving that a woman can fly the A-10 as well as any man, better than most. Now you need to show that to the world, to every girl who's thinking about joining the Air Force but isn't sure she belongs, to every young woman who's been told she's not tough enough, not strong enough, not good enough. You show them that it's bullshit. That's the mission now." Myra sat back, processing. She'd never thought of herself as a role model, never wanted to be one. She just wanted to fly, to serve, to make a difference. But maybe Winters was right. Maybe there were different ways to make a difference. The A-10 demonstration team was unlike anything Myra had done before. Instead of tactical maneuvers over hostile territory, she flew choreographed routines over air shows, rolling and diving and pulling G's for spectators who cheered and took photos. Instead of flight suits and body armor, she wore dress blues and smiled for cameras, answering questions from reporters and children and veterans who wanted to shake her hand. It felt strange at first, performative in a way that combat flying never had been. But then she started noticing the faces in the crowds. The young girls who watched with wide eyes as the A-10 roared overhead, who waited in line for hours just to meet her, who said things like, "I want to be a pilot like you." The women who'd served and never had anyone to look up to, who thanked her for representing them, for proving it was possible. The veterans who'd been on the ground when A-10 saved their lives, who remembered what it meant to hear those turbofans overhead. For them, the demonstration wasn't performance, it was testimony. Proof that the bond between air and ground, between pilot and soldier, still mattered. One afternoon at an air show in Texas, a woman approached Myra after the flight demonstration. She was in her 50s, gray-haired, with the bearing of someone who'd served. "Captain, sorry, Major Volkova," she said. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" "Of course," Myra said. The woman hesitated, then said, "My son was one of the Marines you saved in Helmand. Lance Corporal Mike Torres. He was with Major Richardson's unit." Myra felt her breath catch. "Mrs. Torres." "Call me Alina," the woman said. "Mike told me about what you did. He said you flew through hell to get to them, that you saved his life." Her eyes filled with tears. "He's home now, he's married, he's got a daughter. I'm a grandmother because of you." She reached out and took Myra's hand. "I needed to say thank you. I needed you to know what your courage meant, not just to Mike but to all of us." Myra's throat was tight. "I was just doing my job." "No," Alina said firmly. "You were doing more than that. You were being the person we needed you to be. That's not a job, that's a calling." After Alina left, Myra stood alone for a moment, watching families wander through the static displays of military aircraft. Children climbed on decommissioned tanks, teenagers posed for photos with F-16s, parents read plaques explaining payload capacities and top speeds. They were here for the spectacle, for the noise and the power and the excitement. But underneath that, Myra realized they were here for reassurance. Reassurance that someone was watching over them, that pilots like her existed, that when things went wrong there were people willing to fly into hell to set them right. Maybe Winters had been right. Maybe this was a mission too. Years passed. Myra flew the demonstration circuit for 2 seasons, then transitioned to a staff position at the Pentagon, then returned to command a squadron at Nellis Air Force Base. She made lieutenant colonel, was selected for colonel, kept flying when she could and leading when she had to. Her hair started to gray. Her face gained lines that hadn't been there before. But her hands were still steady, her eyes still sharp, her judgment still sound. The call sign Revenant followed her through every assignment, every promotion, every transition. It became legend in the A-10 community, a name spoken with respect and awe. Young pilots asked her about it constantly, and Myra always told them the truth, that it came from refusing to let someone die from coming back when everyone else had given up. "That's what we do," she'd tell them. "We come back. For our wingmen, for the troops on the ground, for each other. That's the job." Some understood immediately. Others needed time, needed to see combat themselves before they grasped what she meant. But eventually, they all understood. Because that was the nature of the A-10 community, the culture of close air support pilots who flew low and slow and ugly over battlefields where people were dying and needed salvation. They came back. They always came back. On a spring morning 20 years after that flight through fire over Helmand, Colonel Myra Volkova stood on the flight line at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base and watched as the last A-10 she would ever fly was towed into position. It was her retirement flight, the ceremonial final hop that marked the end of a career. She was 52 years old, a full colonel with a chest full of medals and a lifetime of memories. She'd flown in 3 wars, trained hundreds of pilots, commanded squadrons and wings. She'd been shot at, decorated, reprimanded, celebrated, and everything in between. And now it was ending. The waiting for her was pristine, freshly painted, with her name stenciled below the canopy and Revenant emblazoned on the nose. The ground crew had arranged it without being asked, a gesture of respect from people who understood what the call sign meant. Myra walked around the aircraft slowly, running her hand along the fuselage, checking the control surfaces out of habit even though this was a low-risk ceremonial flight. The Warthog felt solid under her touch, familiar, like greeting an old friend. General Winters, now retired himself but present for the ceremony, approached as she completed her walk-around. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Honestly," Myra said, "I don't know, relieved, sad, grateful. All of the above. Yeah, all of the above." They stood together in comfortable silence, 2 pilots at the end of their time watching the younger generation prepare for theirs. Finally, Winters said, "You've had one hell of a career, Volkova. You should be proud." "I am," Myra said. "But I'm also wondering what comes next. I've been flying for 30 years. I don't know how to be anything else." "You'll figure it out," Winters said confidently. "You always do. That's what revenants do, right? They come back, they adapt, they survive." Myra smiled. "I suppose so. Now go fly your airplane one last time, make it count." Myra climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, ran through the pre-flight checks with the muscle memory of 10,000 flights. The engine spooled up, the familiar whine and rumble filling her ears. She taxied to the runway, was cleared for takeoff, and pushed the throttles forward. The A-10 accelerated, lifted, and Myra was flying, truly flying, one last time. She climbed to 5,000 feet and flew west, toward the mountains, toward the desert that stretched endlessly under the Arizona sun. The sky was clear and blue and infinite. Myra rolled the A-10 through gentle maneuvers, nothing aggressive, just feeling the aircraft respond to her inputs, remembering what it was like to be part machine and part will. She thought about all the places this cockpit had taken her, over Iraqi deserts and Afghan mountains, over Syrian cities and training ranges, through fire and smoke, and whether that should have killed her. She thought about the people she'd saved, the students she'd taught, the pilots she'd flown with. She thought about Danny Ortega and Major Richardson and Alina Torres and all the others whose lives had intersected with hers in moments of crisis and grace. They were the real story, not her. She'd just been the pilot. After 30 minutes, Myra turned back toward base, lined up on final approach, and brought the A-10 down one last time. The landing was smooth, textbook perfect, the kind of landing that made instructors nod in approval. She taxied to the parking spot, shut down the engines, and sat in the sudden silence, feeling the stillness settle around her. Then she popped the canopy, climbed out, and stepped onto the wing. Below, a crowd had gathered, her squadron, her students, her family, friends from throughout her career. They applauded as she descended, a standing ovation that echoed across the flight line. General Winters was there, along with her husband Marcus, whom she'd married 5 years ago, and her father, now in his 80s but still strong, still proud. Myra walked to them, accepted their embraces, felt the weight of the moment settle onto her shoulders. "How was it?" Marcus asked. "Perfect," Myra said. And it had been. A perfect end to a chapter, a perfect beginning to whatever came next. The sky would still be there tomorrow. Just because she wasn't flying through it anymore didn't mean it had stopped existing. The retirement ceremony was formal and brief, the way Myra preferred. General Patterson, the same two-star who'd given her both a reprimand and a medal 20 years ago, now a four-star and Air Combat Command commander, presided. He spoke about service and sacrifice, about the changing nature of warfare and the constants of courage and commitment. He talked about Myra's career, the missions and the medals and the lives saved. Then he presented her with a flag, folded and formal, and a plaque with her call sign engraved in gold. "The Air Force is losing one of its finest," Patterson said. "But the legacy you've built will continue through every pilot you trained, every life you saved, every person you inspired. Thank you for your service, Colonel Volkova. We are better because you flew with us." Myra accepted the honors with the stoic grace expected of senior officers, but inside she felt the full weight of transition from who she'd been to who she would become. After the ceremony, as people mingled and shared stories, a young captain approached her. "Ma'am," Myra turned. "Yes, I'm Captain Sarah Chen." "No," Myra interrupted gently. "What's your call sign?" The captain smiled. "Ghost, ma'am." "Better. What can I do for you, Ghost?" "I just wanted to say thank you. I was one of your students 7 years ago in your second weapons school class. You taught me that being a good pilot wasn't about being fearless. It was about being competent enough that fear didn't matter. That lesson saved my life in Syria." Myra studied the young captain, remembering her now, eager, talented, determined. "You saved your own life," Myra said. "I just gave you tools. What you did with them was up to you." "Still," Ghost said, "I wanted you to know. And I wanted to tell you that I'm teaching now, passing on what you taught me. The legacy continues." That phrase, "the legacy continues," stayed with Myra through the evening, through the informal gathering at the officers' club, through the flight home with Marcus. The legacy continues. It was true. She'd spent 3 decades building something larger than herself, a tradition of excellence and commitment that would outlive her career, maybe outlive her life. The young pilots she'd trained were training others, who would train others still, a chain of knowledge and values extending into a future she wouldn't see but had helped shape. That was enough. That was more than enough. Retirement proved stranger than combat ever had. Myra woke each morning without a mission brief, without a schedule, without the structure that had defined her adult life. She tried to fill the time, reading, traveling with Marcus, volunteering at the local Veterans Center, but nothing quite filled the space that flying had occupied. Then 6 months into retirement, she received a call from an unexpected source. "Colonel Volkova, this is Emma Richardson. I'm Major Richardson's daughter." Myra sat up straighter, memory cascading. "Emma, how are you? How's your father?" "He's good, retired now, living in North Carolina, but that's actually why I'm calling. He told me about what you did for him and his Marines in Helmand, and I've been thinking about it a lot. I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I'd like to tell your story. Not just the Helmand mission, but your whole career. What it means to serve, what you had to overcome, how you've influenced an entire generation of pilots." Myra's first instinct was to refuse. She'd never sought publicity, never wanted to be the center of attention. But then she thought about Alina Torres, about Ghost and her other students, about all the young women who'd told her she'd inspired them. Maybe her story wasn't just hers anymore. Maybe it belonged to everyone who needed to hear it. "Okay," she said. "Let's talk." The documentary took 8 months to produce. Emma Richardson was a skilled filmmaker who understood that Myra's story wasn't about heroics. It was about persistence, about refusing to quit when things got hard, about choosing to serve even when the cost was high. She interviewed Myra extensively, dug through military records and mission reports, tracked down people Myra had served with throughout her career. She found Richardson, Danny Ortega, Alina Torres, Colonel Winters, dozens of Myra's former students. She built a portrait not of a superhuman legend, but of a human being who'd made a decision to be excellent and then worked every day to live up to that decision. The finished documentary premiered at film festivals and was eventually picked up by a streaming service. It was titled Revenant, the story of a fighter pilot, and it told Myra's story with honesty and respect, showing both her successes and her struggles. The response was overwhelming. Veterans watched and recognized themselves. Young women watched and saw possibility. Pilots watched and understood the weight of the calling. Myra received hundreds of messages, thank you notes, questions about how to join the Air Force, requests for advice, stories from people whose lives had intersected with hers in ways she'd never known. One message stood out. It was from a 16-year-old girl in Nevada named Alex who wrote, I watched your documentary with my dad, who's a veteran. I never thought I could be a pilot because I'm not that confident and I don't think I'm brave enough. But you said in the film that courage isn't about being fearless, it's about being prepared. That changed everything for me. I'm applying to the Air Force Academy next year. If I make it, I want to fly the A-10 just like you. Thank you for showing me it's possible. Myra read the message 3 times, felt emotion rise in her throat. This was the mission Winters had talked about years ago, the one she'd resisted at first. Showing others what was possible, being the example, making sure the legacy continued. 10 years after her retirement, Myra Volkova stood at a podium at the Air Force Academy, addressing the graduating class of new officers. She was 62 now, her hair silver, her face lined with age and experience. But her voice was still strong, her eyes still sharp, her presence still commanding. I'm not going to tell you that service is easy, she said to the hundreds of young faces looking up at her. It's not. It's hard. It demands everything you have and then asks for more. You'll be tested in ways you can't imagine. You'll face decisions that have no good options, only less bad ones. You'll sacrifice time with your families, opportunities in civilian life, sometimes your health and safety. And you'll do it for people who may never know your name, never understand what you gave up for them. She paused, letting that sink in. But I'm also going to tell you that it's worth it, that the bond you'll form with the people you serve with is stronger than anything else you'll experience. That the satisfaction of doing something that matters, that protecting people who can't protect themselves, is deeper than any other reward. I spent 30 years as a combat pilot, Myra continued. I flew through fire and fear and situations that should have killed me, but I never once regretted my choice to serve, because every time I strapped into that cockpit, I knew I was part of something larger than myself. I was part of a tradition of service that stretches back generations and will continue for generations to come. And now, you're part of that tradition too. She looked out at the sea of faces, saw the eagerness and uncertainty and hope reflected there. Some of you will fly, some will lead ground troops, some will work intelligence or logistics or any of the hundreds of specialties that make the military function. All of those roles matter. All of them require courage and commitment. And all of you have the capacity to be extraordinary if you choose to be. So my challenge to you today is this: be the person who comes back. When your team needs you, when the mission seems impossible, when everything is falling apart, be the one who doesn't quit. Be the one who finds a way. Be the revenant, because that's what we do. We come back. We always come back. The applause was thunderous, sustained, genuine. Myra stepped away from the podium and watched as the graduates threw their caps into the air, watched as they celebrated and hugged and began the journey that would define their lives. At the reception, a young lieutenant approached her. She was in her early 20s with dark hair and determined eyes. Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Alex Torres. I wanted to meet you. Myra's heart skipped. Torres, are you related to Alina Torres? She's my grandmother, Alex said, smiling. And Lance Corporal Mike Torres was my father. He told me about what you did in Helmand before he died. He always said I should meet you if I got the chance. I'm so sorry about your father, Myra said gently. When did he pass? 3 years ago, cancer, but he lived a good life because of the time you gave him. He saw me grow up. He taught me to be strong. And when I told him I wanted to be a pilot, he said, good, be like Myra Volkova, be someone who comes back. Alex's eyes were bright with emotion. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to flight school. I'm going to fly the A-10, and I'm going to carry on what you started. Myra felt tears prick her eyes. This was the answer to every question she'd ever had about whether her service mattered, whether the sacrifices had been worth it. Here stood the daughter of a man she'd saved, choosing to serve, carrying forward the legacy. "You honor me," Myra said quietly, "and you honor your father. He'd be proud." "I hope so," Alex said. "And ma'am, thank you for everything." They embraced, two pilots separated by decades but connected by purpose, by the unbreakable bond of service and sacrifice. And Myra Volkova, who had flown through fire and fear, who had saved lives and trained warriors, who had given 3 decades to the sky and the fight, felt the weight of her legacy settle gently on her shoulders, not as burden but as completion. The story had come full circle. She had been the revenant coming back when others couldn't, refusing to let people die. Now others would take up that mantle, would be the ones who came back, who refused to quit. The legacy would continue. The mission would endure. And somewhere high above, the sky waited for the next generation of pilots to claim it. The legacy had always been larger than one person, one flight, one moment of courage. It was the accumulation of thousands of decisions to serve, to sacrifice, to be better. It was written in the contrails of aircraft that had flown before and would fly again, in the memories of people saved and missions completed, in the young pilots who looked up and said, "I want to do that." Myra had added her chapter to that story, had carved her name into the history of the A-10 and the culture of close air support. But the story would continue without her, carried forward by Alex Torres and Ghost and all the others she'd touched. Years later, when Myra Volkova finally passed away at the age of 79, surrounded by family and at peace, the Air Force honored her with a memorial service at Arlington National Cemetery. Hundreds of people attended, pilots she'd flown with, students she'd taught, Marines she'd saved, family members of those she'd served with. General Winters was there, aged but still strong. Elena Torres was there, walking with a cane but determined to pay respects. Major Richardson was there with his grandchildren. And Alex Torres was there, now a major herself, wearing her flight suit and the wings she'd earned, carrying forward the tradition. The service was military precise and deeply moving, with a missing man formation of A-10s thundering overhead, one peeling away to symbolize the fallen pilot. But it was Alex Torres who gave the final eulogy, standing before the assembled crowd with the confidence and grace of someone who'd learned from the best. Myra Volkova once said that being a good pilot wasn't about being fearless, it was about being prepared, Alex began. She said that courage was a choice made every day to show up and do the work even when it was hard. She said that we come back. We always come back. For our wingmen, for the troops on the ground, for each other. "I never flew with Colonel Volkova," Alex continued, "but I've flown with her legacy. Every time I strap into my A-10, I feel her presence. Every time I make a decision in combat, I hear her voice in my head asking the questions she taught us to ask. What's the mission? Who needs me? What's the right thing to do? She shaped not just my career but my character. And I'm not alone in that. Look around this gathering. How many of us are here because of her? How many lives were touched by her courage, her teaching, her refusal to quit?" The crowd was silent, attentive, united in grief and gratitude. Myra Volkova was a revenant, Alex said, her voice strong despite the emotion. She came back when others couldn't. She refused to let people die. She fought through fire and fear and impossible odds because that's what needed to be done. And she taught us to do the same. That's her legacy. That's what lives on. Alex paused, looked up at the sky where the A-10s had disappeared into the blue. "So today, we don't just mourn a pilot. We celebrate a warrior, a teacher, a leader, and a friend. We celebrate someone who showed us what service means, what courage looks like, what it means to be part of something larger than ourselves. And we make a promise that we'll carry forward what she taught us, that we'll be the ones who come back, that the legacy will continue." She saluted the flag-draped casket, her hands sharp and steady. "Clear skies and tailwinds, Colonel Volkova, you've earned your rest. We have the watch now." The service ended with taps, with the folding of the flag, with final salutes from people who had known and loved and been shaped by Myra Volkova. They dispersed slowly, reluctant to leave, sharing stories and memories and promises to stay in touch. But the legacy didn't end. It never ends. Because that's the nature of service. It transcends individual lives, connects generations, build something permanent in a temporary world. Years later, when young pilots at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base walk past the squadron building, they see a plaque mounted near the entrance. It bears the image of an A-10 Thunderbolt II, trailing smoke and fire but still flying, still fighting. Below the image are words, "In memory of Colonel Myra Volkova, Revenant, who taught us that courage is a choice, that preparation defeats fear, and that we come back. We always come back." New pilots pause to read those words, wondering about the woman behind them, about the story of the burning, and the pilot who wouldn't quit. And some of them, inspired by words carved in metal and a legacy written in courage, decide to be better pilots, better officers, better people. They decide to come back when others can't, to refuse to quit when the mission matters, to be the revenant for someone who needs them. That's how legends work. They start with one person making one choice in one moment. Then they ripple outward, touching others, inspiring them to make their own choices, their own sacrifices, until eventually the legend becomes larger than the person, becomes a standard by which others measure themselves. Myra Volkova had become that legend, but she would have said it wasn't about her. It was about the mission, the people she served with, the lives she saved. She was just a pilot doing her job. The sky didn't care about legends. It only cared about those brave enough to claim it. And so the story ends, not with death, but with continuation. With young pilots learning to fly, with veterans teaching what they know, with the endless cycle of service and sacrifice that defines the military profession. Myra Volkova is gone, but Revenant lives on, in call signs and lessons learned, in the students who became teachers, in every pilot who hears about the burning and thinks, "I could do that. I would do that." The legacy continues. The sky remains, and somewhere in hangars and ready rooms and cockpits around the world, pilots strap in and prepare to fly. Because that's what they do, that's what she taught them. They come back. They always come back.